The Struggle for Northeast Syria's Future. Article by Karena Avedissian. Published on February 20, 2026, on EVN Report. In January 2026, Syria's transitional government launched a military offensive against the Kurdish-led Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria, AANES, also known as Rojava, threatening to dismantle over a decade of pluralistic governance built from civil war. What began as an assault on two neighborhoods in Aleppo rapidly escalated into a coordinated campaign across northeast Syria, backed by Turkey and tacitly supported by the United States and Israel, each pursuing their own vision of post-Assad order. This was not just a military confrontation between Damascus and northeast Syria, but an imposition of centralized statehood on a decentralized model of pluralism and autonomy. Among those most at risk are the region's Islamized Armenians, many descendants of 1915 genocide survivors who had rebuilt political, cultural, and social institutions under AANES governance. The integration agreement signed on January 30th halted the immediate fighting, but left a critical question unresolved. Can the communities of the Northeast, including Armenians, Kurds, Assyrians, and other minorities, retain their political agency and the social gains they made over a decade, and to what degree? The STG Offensive. Aims and actors. Barely a week after the new year, Syrian Transitional Government (STG) forces, supported by Turkish-backed groups, attacked Aleppo's AANES-controlled and majority Kurdish-populated neighborhoods of Sheikh Maqsoud and Ashrafiyeh. The assault came one day after a meeting between Syrian Foreign Minister Assad Hassan al-Shahibani and Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan, timing that suggested a strong degree of coordination between Syria and Turkey in the offensive. The transitional government had already severely restricted access to the two Aleppo enclaves for weeks, controlling entry points and stopping supplies, creating a de facto blockade. After the neighborhoods fell to government forces, AANES Asayish, internal security, forces withdrew to core AANES territory, marking the start of a wider offensive. By January 13th, Damascus declared Maskana and Deir Hafir in the eastern Aleppo countryside closed military zones and launched a coordinated offensive against positions held by the Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF, the armed forces of the AANES. Within days, operations expanded into Raqqa, Deir ez-Zor, and Hasaka governorates. Arab tribal defections, encouraged by Damascus, accelerated SDF territorial losses. The city of Kobane, symbolic for its resistance to ISIS and the AANES's resilience, became a focal point. Kobane was subjected to sustained shelling by Turkish-backed forces, supply cutoffs, and mass displacement in harsh winter conditions, and the city neared humanitarian collapse. Ceasefires were periodically declared but never fully held. Its blockade continues as of this writing. On January 18th, Syrian Transitional President Ahmed al-Shara unilaterally announced an integration framework that amounted to capitulation for the AANES, leaving no room for any autonomy. He used military gains to present subjugation as the only alternative to continued assault. SDF Commander-in-Chief Mazloum Abdi was reportedly offered a high-ranking position, a personal concession in exchange for institutional dismantling. The cards were stacked against the AANES. Turkey had long sought to dismantle Kurdish autonomy in Syria and escalated militarily at a moment when regional and international dynamics tilted in its favor. Washington had already begun recasting Ahmed al-Shara as a counter-terrorism partner, sidelining the SDF's long-standing role in the fight against ISIS, while Ankara escalated pressure. Both the United States and Israel signaled a preference for a centralized Syrian authority over democratic decentralization, narrowing the political space in which AANES could maneuver. Despite formal rhetoric of inclusion, the emerging post-Assad order, shaped by Damascus, Ankara, Washington, and Tel Aviv, created an environment in which the AANES's autonomy was no longer treated as a political reality to negotiate with, but as an obstacle to be eliminated. Facing military assault, territorial losses, international abandonment, and an ultimatum to strip away its autonomy, the AANES chose to resist. What was at stake? A decade of political and social transformation. Since the height of the Syrian civil war, the AANES and its military arm, the SDF, had exercised de facto control over northeast Syria. Their legitimacy derived from defeating ISIS and constructing a distinctive political model. Decentralized councils, multi-ethnic participation, Kurds, Arabs, Assyrians, Armenians, co-leadership between men and women, ecological protection, and cooperative-based economics. The significance of this experiment extends far beyond its formal structures. In a region where state power has historically meant minority erasure, assimilation, or managed tokenism, AANES represented a fundamental challenge to authoritarian and homogenizing governance. Its model of democratic confederalism, emphasizing grassroots democracy, gender equality, and autonomous organization for all ethnic and social groups, stood in direct opposition to both the Assad regime's Ba'athist centralism and the Turkish state's suppression of Kurdish identity. This is not to say the system was without problems. AANES governance faced serious tensions, particularly with Assyrian communities who complained of Kurdish domination in practice and restrictions on their political organizing. Arab tribal leaders in Deir ez-Zor also resisted SDF control. The reality on the ground often fell short of the ideals articulated in AANES's political framework. Yet for women, AANES institutionalized leadership at every level of governance and created autonomous women's organizations and defense forces. An imperfect but nonetheless radical departure in a Syrian context where women had been largely excluded from political power, and a regional context where patriarchal authority structures dominate. The YPJ, Women's Protection Units, became both a military force and a symbol of women's agency in one of the world's most patriarchal regions. For minorities long erased or instrumentalized by the Syrian state, this framework, despite its contradictions, proved transformative compared to the available alternatives. It enabled political reconstitution on their own terms, rather than as subjects of state management. Assyrians, Armenians, Arabs, and others could organize autonomously, claim representation regardless of religion, and assert cultural and linguistic rights that had been systematically denied under both Ottoman and Ba'athist rule, even as they contested the limits and inequalities within AANES structures. The stakes of the January offensive were therefore not just territorial or administrative. What stood under threat was an imperfect but pluralistic alternative to authoritarian centralization in Syria, and by extension, the hard-won political agency of minority communities. However contested and tenuous, that agency risked being rolled back into hierarchical management under a Damascus-led system with a history of exclusion. Among those who stand to lose are northeast Syria's Islamized Armenians, descendants of 1915 genocide survivors who had been orphaned as children, forcibly adopted into Muslim families, and gradually stripped of language and identity over generations. Under the AANES, they had reconstituted themselves politically for the first time, founding institutions like the Armenian Social Council, the Martyr Nubar Ozanyan Brigade, and cultural organizations that began addressing decades of erasure, popular mobilization, and the return to negotiations. Following the SDF's formal rejection of Damascus's unilateral January 18 peace deal, STG forces resumed military operations against the AANES. For many communities in northeast Syria, the escalation was experienced as an immediate existential threat. The advancing forces included armed factions linked to networks and ideologies previously tied to displacement, atrocities, and ethnic cleansing in the region. These included groups associated with the Sultan Murad and Hamza brigades, the same bodies that sent mercenaries to Artsakh during the 2020 Artsakh War, and which ethnically cleansed Kurds from Afrin in 2018. In response, segments of the civilian population took part in local defense efforts. This was not an offensive mobilization, but an attempt to prevent a return to conditions of displacement, insecurity, and loss of autonomy that many residents had previously endured. The mobilization extended far beyond northeast Syria's borders. Across Turkey, Kurds mobilized in cities such as Van, Mardin, and Diyarbakir. In Nusaybin, directly across the Turkish border from AANES's Kamishli, crowds surged toward the border with some managing to cross. The border crossing's Turkish flag was torn down. A young man accused of the act was detained and reportedly tortured. From Iraqi Kurdistan, special forces from Sulaymaniyah crossed into northeast Syria in support. From Europe, International activists organized the People's Caravan to break Kobani's siege, only to be stopped and arrested. Some were subjected to psychological torture and sexual assault before being deported by Turkish authorities. Other delegations attempting to document protests faced detention. This mobilization altered the balance. While it did not halt territorial losses, it disrupted Damascus's attempt to impose a total military solution after failing to force a one-sided capitulation agreement. Simultaneously, intensive diplomatic efforts by SDF commander Mazloum Abdi and AANES Foreign Relations Representative Ilham Ahmad, including consultations with U.S. Syria envoy Tom Barrack and Kurdish leaders in Iraqi Kurdistan, worked to multiply back-channel contacts, secure international backing, and maintain channels of negotiation. The combination of military resistance, popular mobilization, and Kurdish unity on the streets, and sustained diplomatic engagement by regional Kurdish leaders forced Damascus to return to the negotiating table and international actors to recalibrate. 3 principles were flagged as non-negotiable: self-defense, decentralized governance, and language and education rights. The presence of the SDF and the popular mobilization were decisive in preventing what historical precedent suggests could have been large-scale atrocities against the region's minority populations. The 2025 massacres of Alawites and Druze by government forces and affiliated militias provide a clear picture. Where communities lacked organized military capacity and international solidarity networks, they faced systematic violence. The Northeast's mobilization functioned on 3 levels. Militarily, it prevented complete territorial collapse. Politically, it reframed the conflict from an administrative dispute to a question of minority survival and self-determination with regional implications. And strategically, it generated sufficient international pressure to shift Damascus's calculus from pursuing total military victory to accepting negotiated settlement. The January 30th agreement, where we stand now. The Syrian government and the SDF announced a revised agreement on January 30th that formalized the ceasefire and set out a phased framework for integrating military and administrative structures. Unlike earlier arrangements imposed under military pressure, the deal was more of a negotiated compromise, incorporating concessions that preserved core elements of Kurdish-led self-administration while reasserting Damascus's sovereignty. The agreement's language remains imprecise and open to interpretation, but it is widely acknowledged to have prevented the dismantling of the AANES by force. This agreement differed substantially from the January 18th deal concluded amid the government's rapid military campaign to seize territories held by the SDF. That earlier framework envisioned the integration of SDF fighters as individuals and implied full disarmament. By contrast, the January 30th agreement allows the SDF to retain dedicated brigades and provides for gradual integration rather than immediate dissolution. Militarily, SDF forces withdrew from front lines and were reorganized into a new division comprising 3 brigades alongside a Kobani brigade. The Women's Defense Forces, the YPJ, was formally retained. The agreement would permit Syrian Interior Ministry forces to deploy to the centers of Hasaka and Kamishli under joint administrative arrangements, while allowing the SDF to retain 4 military brigades, 3 brigades for Hasaka province plus 1 separate brigade for Kobane. Strategic assets, including oil fields, borders, airports, and ISIS detention camps, were transferred to state control. Civically, AANES institutions were subordinated to Damascus while retaining limited local authority. Local councils and co-leadership structures remain formally in place. The government will coordinate with the Ministry of Education to determine an educational pathway for the Kurdish community and consider forms of educational specificity. While the January 18th agreement recognized Kurdish as a mother tongue, by decree rather than law, and therefore technically reversible, the current text does not explicitly reaffirm that status, leaving ambiguity over whether the commitment still stands. AANES-issued education certificates will be recognized, and provisions will allow for the return of displaced civilians to areas such as Afrin and Sheikh Maqsoud. The agreement outlines a structured transfer of strategic assets. Oil fields were handed over to the Ministry of Energy, and Kamishli Airport to the Civil Aviation Authority. Border crossings are likewise slated for transfer to state control. Notably, however, ISIS detention camps remain under SDF protection, rather than being placed fully under Damascus's authority. Politically, the agreement marked both a symbolic milestone and a moment of uncertainty for Kurdish representation in Syria's future. Nur al-Din Isa, an SDF general, was nominated as governor of Hasakah, the first Kurd to hold such a post. AANES leaders framed the deal as one that avoided broader war. Mazloum Abdi emphasized the preservation of cultural and administrative gains. Tevdem, AANES's umbrella body for political bodies and councils, described it as a step toward stability. Ilham Ahmed called it a new phase of political, legal, and constitutional struggle. Others, including PYD head Salih Muslim, warned that past agreements had gone unfulfilled and urged vigilance. The agreement represents a provisional settlement rather than a final resolution. It averted immediate catastrophe but subordinates AANES institutions to central authority. The region's experiment in grassroots democracy, multi-ethnic governance, and gender equality, developed amid the fight against ISIS and under constant external pressure, now faces accelerated erosion. Implementation began in early February. Nonetheless, the design of the integration mechanism will determine whether the agreement succeeds and how it will proceed. From the viewpoint of communities that have benefited from AANES's decentralized and inclusive model, particularly Kurds, Armenians, and other minorities, serious concerns remain. The Armenian case within the AANES. The AANES offered one of the most radical political alternatives to emerge from Syria's war. This has been especially true for northeast Syria's little-known Islamized Armenians. Descendants of 1915 genocide survivors, many had been orphaned as children, forcibly adopted into Muslim families, and gradually stripped of language and identity over generations. Under Ba'athist rule, and even in Armenian diaspora networks centered around the Armenian Apostolic and Catholic churches, they remained unknown, unrecognized, and invisible. AANES's democratic confederalism changed that. It encouraged all ethnic and social groups to organize autonomously and claim representation regardless of religion, allowing these Armenians to reconstitute themselves politically for the first time. In 2019, they founded the Armenian Social Council in Hasakah, the Martyr Nubar Ozanyan Brigade in the SDF. These were later followed by the creation of an Armenian Women's Union, the Armenian Union Party, and an Armenian Women's Battalion under the YPJ. Local councils, co-chair systems, and reserved representation gave them institutional voice alongside Kurds, Arabs, Assyrians, and others. Western Armenian language classes, April 24th commemorations, and cultural events began to address decades of erasure. The January 2026 integration agreement puts these fragile gains in jeopardy. Should Damascus renege, Islamized Armenians may be forced to return to managed invisibility under a centralized state that historically preferred minorities silent or assimilated. In this sense, the Armenian case is not exceptional, but illustrative. It reveals how centralization in post-Assad Syria can reproduce older logics of dominance, hierarchy, and exclusion, and how the destruction of autonomous, pluralistic governance aligns with broader imperial and authoritarian strategies that undermine minority self-determination.